back to the news today with a special extended edition. Still with me here in the studio is Daniel Shank. Good evening. Tzchak Levanon, good evening. And also joining us, Shin Bet, good evening. And the reason that you are here is that Israeli authorities announced today the arrest of a group of 6 Arab citizens from the town of Jaljulia who are alleged to have made plans to join Islamic State in Syria. The investigation began after another Jaljulia native, Nadal Salah, paraglided into Syria last month in order to join the terror group. And you have more information about that.
You know, it's interesting to know that there are some interesting parallels between this case and what we are seeing really in France and Paris with these attacks. For example, one of these 6 brothers who was arrested today has already been to Syria, spent about a year in Syria in 2013 and managed incredibly to make it back to Israel, whereupon he was arrested at the airport and spent a year in jail. After that, he was basically released, and it turns out that he continued to, let's say, engage in a jihadist activity, and nonetheless, and basically encouraged and perhaps inspired those who were around him, including family members and a number of others. He, along with his brother, who managed to make it to Syria, practiced and mentally prepared themselves for a paraglide journey into Syria. Of course, the brother made it. He eventually did not. 2 others tried to make it also to Syria through Turkey and eventually turned back. And we're talking about yet another IS cell broken up before it really managed to carry out any major attacks in Israel and before most of its members actually managed to get into Syria. But this is not the first similar sort of cell. It's interesting to note that because of the Israeli security apparatus, they are able to keep these militants or let's say, wannabe militants at a level where they do not yet pose a serious threat, at least, to Israeli security.
Yeah, so we are staying with a similar subject. Israel and continent remain far apart on many issues. Even when they agree, they still seem far apart, as Eli Ochenberg explains in this report, looking at the different attempts to link the Paris attacks to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and vice versa.
Israel-Europe relations have known better days. One disagreement seems to be following another, piling up and mining an ideological abyss. But the latest massive terror attack in Paris seems to have created a common ground. Both sides find the events linked to the situation in Israel, but from different perspectives and possibly for different reasons as well.
The forces of civilization, when they realize the severity of this problem, have no option but to unite very clearly and defeat these beasts. The beasts increasingly have a name. It is radical Islam.
But while the Israeli premier, as well as many other Israeli politicians, diplomats, and public figures, views the common denominator as the fight against radical Islam, others, notably Swedish Foreign Minister Margot Wallström, also see a link between Israel, the West Bank, and Europe. In an interview to the Swedish SVT, Wallström said,
"It reminds us of the situation in the Middle East, where the Palestinians see that there is no future for them and have to either accept a desperate situation or resort to violence."
Unsurprisingly, Jerusalem did not accept those comments whatsoever, releasing a furious condemnation, calling the remarks shockingly hostile, and the foreign ministry summoned the Swedish ambassador for a dressing down.
People said things that were incredibly stupid. They said that the conflict in the Middle East, the conflict, always in the singular, the core of the conflict in the Middle East was the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's ridiculous. It always was ridiculous, but it's particularly ridiculous today. It's particularly obnoxious, when they accuse us, the victims, of the terrorism that is leveled against us.
Linking IS terrorism to the situation in Israel and the Palestinian territories may be an unfortunate slip of the tongue, or it may be a blunt provocation. But for many decades, especially in recent years, Israel's diplomacy has revolved around its fight against terror, claiming it's a microcosm or original part of a larger global battle.
The larger picture, modernity against medievalism. In our part of the Middle Eastern woods, the persistent refusal to accept Israel in any border.
The link Jerusalem has sought to make may finally be sinking in, but not in the way Israeli leaders want to hear.
To the people of France,
And joining me right now through the phone is Natalie Rothschild, a freelance journalist based in Stockholm. Good evening. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So basically, from what I understood, and correct me if I'm wrong, you're asking yourself, what is the big fuss?
The big fuss around our foreign minister's statement, is that what you're referring to? Yes. Well, yes, because I think that media reports started emerging in Israel that then reached Israeli politicians and then was taken to a diplomatic level. But those reports were initially based on a 30-second clip out of a roughly 15-minute long interview that our foreign minister gave on Saturday morning on Swedish television. And I think that in this case, there's a lot of misinterpretations going around from people who I presume haven't seen the whole interview, seeing as it's in Swedish and 15-minute long.
Yeah, I believe that also we are all in the media in this business, and we understand what happens when you take just a small clip and put it all over again. But I'm asking you, do you think that maybe it was not correct to compare what is happening in Israel and the Palestinians and what is happening with Daesh and Europe? This is a little bit problematic comparing between the two, even for the Palestinians, by the way, to compare Daesh to the Palestinians.
Well, I think that as a question in itself, yeah, you certainly have a point. But I watched the whole interview, and I have to say it's a misinterpretation to say that in this instance that is what she did. That's what I'm saying. But of course, that would be a very troublesome comparison.
What did she say?
It was an interview that, of course, was framed around what had just happened the evening before in Paris, but it moved on to, she talked about that event and what was known on Saturday morning around that event, about the terrorist threat at large, about the war in Syria and Russia's involvement. She talked about radicalization in general, and about 2/3 into the interview, she was asked if she's concerned about radicalization of Swedish citizens and Swedish citizens joining the IS, or the Islamic State.
What is this?
And so,
yes.
And it had moved at that point. Had moved on from a discussion of purely of what happened in Paris, and what she did then was talk more generally about radicalization instead of addressing the question of Swedish citizens. She started talking about radicalization in the Middle East, and then mentioned the Palestinians.
So let's talk about Swedish citizens and Swedish people and the Swedish Muslims who are living in Stockholm, for example. How do they feel towards the country and towards the policy of the country? And do they feel the same feelings that the French Muslim people feel?
You mean towards the Swedish policy,
yes.
Swedish politics?
Yes.
Well, it's hard for me to obviously talk on behalf of and for all Muslims living in Sweden. I'm not one of them myself, but I think we're seeing a similar situation in Swedish cities as we are in other European cities, with segregation and alienation and a turn among some sections towards Islamist ideology. Certainly that is also happening in Sweden. The security level was raised just a few hours ago here because there's a person believed to be on the run and there's a manhunt on. And so, I mean, we're obviously being affected by the same situation of radicalization and of the homegrown threat, or whatever you want to call it, of people who've grown up in Sweden and who are still being attacked to Islamist and extremist ideologies. And I think roughly somewhere between 200 and 300, I can't remember the exact figure.
I think that my question was
joined IS.
Yeah, my question just was more towards will Sweden wake up one day and will say what France is saying today, the lack of integration, the lack of education, the problem that we didn't give them enough job and opportunities and to be actual part of Sweden. Will it happen also to Sweden?
Yeah, I think Yeah, I think this is the disgrace because they have been given education and they have been given the same opportunities that other, citizens in Sweden are given. So it's actually, there's no fault on the part of society. It's not the case that these individuals have been left, excluded from the system, from the welfare system, and so on.
Yes.
So that's the disgrace that they're still kind of turning against, in those instances, mainstream society in a very violent way.
Yes, Natalie.
Yeah.
Yeah, Natalie Rothschild, thank you very much for this conversation with us. So I will ask you too, what is the big fuss? So she talked about the Palestinians and the Israeli conflict. All Europe is talking about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. All Europe wants to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but it cannot. So maybe all Europe is always trying to connect things when it starts being not comfortable enough for them.
Let's do it the American way.
Okay.
I'll start with a disclaimer. The disclaimer is the following. I do not believe that there is a direct connection between the Palestinian-Israeli conflict and what happened in Paris. Okay? We got that out of the way? Fine. Now here you have two leaders saying roughly, not exactly, but roughly the same thing, only for opposite reasons, with opposite motivations, and when they finally listen to each other, they are mad at each other. She says, well, she didn't say it in so many words, but the way it was interpreted here is one of the reasons that this is happening is because you didn't solve the Palestinian problem, which I think is a sign of a lot of ignorance. It's the sort of European talk of leaders who don't know the problem, but they know the mantras. They know that anything bad happening in the Middle East has probably to do with the Palestinians. And if it has to do with the Palestinians, then the Israelis are to blame.
Of course.
On the other hand, you have Prime Minister Netanyahu, who makes a huge effort in the past few days to say, listen, guys, we're fighting the same war. You are fighting against Daesh, we are fighting against Hamas. It's exactly the same thing. And
he spoke about the recent wave of terror coming from the Palestinians,
and
from the West
Bank,
Bank, from East Jerusalem.
And I think it's just as ignorant to say that, only for a different reason. But basically, they're saying the same thing.
So why the diplomatic
Lucy,
problem?
Look, first of all, I endorse the disclaimer, okay? I'm okay. I am okay with this. The second thing I think, look, in politics and in diplomacy, the timing is very important. And what it comes, from leaders, and she's the foreign minister. I mean, it's a leader. I think that the timing was a bad timing. France, is fighting terrorism, and everybody, is talking about what happened. And this is really a terrorist attack. And you have the reactions coming from whether the population or the government of France and the international community and Europe, etc. And suddenly, one of the members of the EU, he's talking about something which do not correspond with the reality on the ground. So the timing is important, and I think that she chose a very poor time, to say that.
Well, what she said, according to the best of my knowledge, is the fact that the terror acts in Paris were due to the reason of the lack of hope that Muslims see in Europe. And she said the same.
You didn't say it in so many words.
Yeah, but the same.
It's a bit roundabout.
I'm trying to look into it because they were looking into it. And she said the same thing happens in Palestine, and due to the Palestinian issue, the lack of hope really penetrates Europe. But if I remember correctly, the head of Israeli military intelligence said the same thing. The head of Israeli internal security services, the Shin Bet, said the same thing. They all said that the Palestinians, the last wave of terror by the Palestinians, is not due to nationalistic reasons, is not due to any kind of militant armed resistance. They both said that they believe that the last wave of violence is due to the lack of hope within the Palestinian community. If that is correct, and this is what she said, and I do agree that both the foreign minister of Sweden and the prime minister Benjamin Netanyahu are saying the same thing, exactly the same thing. And I do accept the fact that there is no connection between what happened in France and what is happening here. eventually what we have, according to Morgenthau, is a huge misconception here. On the one hand side, people are trying to hammer the EU because they don't want the EU intervening between the Israeli and Palestinian issue. On the other hand, we have a group of diplomats who are trying to pressure Israel to get into an arrangement with the Palestinians in order to solve something that they are extremely invested in. And as a result, we have this kind of like tension. Timing is everything, of course, in every matter, of course.
So I want to ask you, should Israel jump on this ship and be involved in what is happening right now in Europe? Because until now, Israel decided that it's looking and just sitting on the fence with everything that is happening with Syria, with everything that is happening on its borders. And maybe Israel should not be the first to react, the first to say, okay, we want to tell you that it's just like us, and now you will understand us, and now you understand what we are fighting. Should maybe Israel stay aside also concerning this issue?
It's always good.
Yes, but it's not realistic, you know. But the question is, jumping up is fine, but the question is, what do you say after you jump up? And what you should say, of course, is that we are on the same side of this fight against Islamic radicalism, that we have plenty of experience in intelligence against these people. So, guys, if you need any assistance, we're here. All sorts of things like that. But let's call a spade a spade. What Benjamin Netanyahu and the government here wants is to extract more understanding for Israeli occupation and for the settlements and to say this is actually the whole thing. We are not really, the problem is not us occupying. The problem is that we are fighting, like you, against Islamic radicalism, which is just an untruth. It is, I mean, not that we're not fighting against Islamic groups too, but that is not the source of our fight with them.
They want just to ignore the reasons.
It's just an unreasonable expectation. If they think that in the wake of tragedy in Paris, there will suddenly be an awakening in Europe, and they will say, actually, you know what, these Israelis, they're right. We should leave them alone, and they should keep staying in the West Bank and build settlements, and we should leave them alone. That is just probably not going to happen.
It's timing.
It's Israel a little bit naive.
But Israel, timing is everything. Israel is trying to capitalize on a terror act that is happening in Europe, in the center of Europe, and is trying to show everybody else. And I don't think they're fighting at the diplomatic arena. They're fighting at the public opinion arena. Now what is going on, the public opinion in Europe, at least some of it, is really terrified because we saw what happened. We spoke about football, and then a day later, in a game between Holland and Germany, they allegedly found an ambulance full with explosive, and they canceled the game. Belgium immediately announced that it will not hold the games because they do not feel that they have the ability to guarantee the safety of people. Now, in this atmosphere, Israel is, of course, jumping on the bandwagon and saying, well, look, guys, all of a sudden you woke up and you understand what we've been going through. It's not us. It's them. You're fighting them just as we are fighting them. Now the them is collective. The them are the Muslims. And I think Benjamin Netanyahu really foresees the opportunity and is trying to seize it. On the other hand, what he's doing is he's losing a different opportunity, because what he could have said is, okay, this is now going into a different arena. Now the Europeans. Now let's try and somehow convince the European diplomats that what we need to do is sit on a fair ground without preconditions and try to negotiate. But he's reluctant to do that for the past decade.
The question is, do we really, we Israelis, I mean, really need to take the entire fight against Islamism on our backs? Do we need to have the responsibility all on our own?
According to Netanyahu, is yes.
Yeah, according
Definitely
to Benjamin Netanyahu, yes. Definitely yes. We may be the leaders, like we were the leaders of the fight in Iran and the Iranian deal. Just you were talking, gentlemen, about the timing, and timing is everything. And just yesterday, we woke up to the decision by Israel to ban the northern branch of the Islamic movement here in Israel. And I wonder if it is the timing, and how come Israel just woke up today and what it's trying to signal to Europe, that here we are doing enough, and how come Israel didn't stop the Northern Branch Islamic movement from doing what it's doing just a year ago when they had a big conference in Al-Fahim with 40,000 people, with Raed Salah talking to these 40,000 people and inciting. So how come now?
Well, I think that tactically it's understandable why now. The interesting thing is that in parallel to the publication of the decision, there was also a leak saying that actually the decision is 2 weeks old, and they just announced it now. So, which underlines what I'm saying. Tactically, probably the government thought that it would, at least on the international, it will be easily accepted.
Yeah.
It would not be. It would not awaken so much criticism in the West. Which I believe is probably a reasonable thing to do. Now, the general idea to ban them or not to ban them is not what we're discussing here, but I think it's a tactical decision.
It's important to say that the northern faction of the Islamic movement has been on the table
for many
years.
Time.
It's not something new. The debate has been long gone,
and back and forth,
and Raed Salah is in prison back and forth as well. Just to remind people, the decision to ban Israeli institutions or participating in Israeli institutions is not that old, because they were controlling Al-Fahim for years, and they were running for municipalities all over the country, and they took part at the Higher Commission of the Arab Public in Israel. Now, what the decision is saying literally is banning them as a legal movement, which means they cannot participate in any elections or any institutions. However, they will be able to have meetings and assemblies under different names or in mosques. Basically, I think the timing of the final decision is understood, obviously. However, I think it's a huge mistake to outlaw them. It's a huge mistake because, on the other hand, people are expecting the same government to outlaw Lehava, which they didn't do.
It has to be said that there have been Jewish Israeli political movements banned from running.
Kahana and also Molede.
Yes, so I don't feel too uncomfortable with this general idea, and I'm not sure that the balance has to be struck here. But again, I don't know the details about the decision on Raed Salah and his movement, but it's not an unprecedented move.
Definitely not.
Again, I would like to go back to the timing. I think that the timing, with banning this movement, I think it was the correct time. And what Daniel mentioned is correct, that the decision was taken 2 weeks ago. And according to the circumstances, they said, look, this is not the appropriate time to do it. And after what happened in France, etc., let's say that the circumstances or the international conjecture, they say, look, probably the climate is better. It's like, you are using any aircraft and you have a bad weather, so you don't pound, you don't shoot. And you wait, until that you have a clear skies. And this is what happened. The decision has been taken, and I fully agree. This is not the first time that we are talking about banning, this movement. And Raed Salah was 4 or 5 times in prison, etc.
Yes.
So I think that the timing was okay. Now, we're not talking about if it's a good decision or is a bad decision. Let's wait and see until the strike, going on in the Arab sector tomorrow, and we will discuss it probably in the next coming days. But look, in front of this is, the part of the government. In front of incitement, or when you are convinced that there are incitements, or that you are convinced that the behavior or the activity of this group is harming, let's say, the security of a state, and this we have seen it, everywhere. We have seen it, in Egypt. We have seen it everywhere. I mean, in every country. So you take the steps necessary in order to stop it. Now you have to wait and see what would be the consequences, because not everybody, it was not done by a consensus.
No.
We know that inside Israel, you have people who says, no, this is a bad decision. So wait and see 1 or 2 days. But the timing was the appropriate time.
Still, the leader of the movement, Sheikh Raed Salah, is standing a trial right now. He's standing trial, and he's expected to go back to
Unrelated.
prison. Yeah, unrelated,
Yes.
and he's expected to go back to prison. So that is also important
But the
to say.
timing was good. I mean, the
Well,
appropriate
good.
time. It was
No,
the appropriate
I
time.
wonder really if these events eventually will change the approach. And, you know, we're seeing France going out in the last few days, going out in raids and checking and security forces on the streets. And I wonder if this specific attack will change the approach of Europe towards Israel and towards its fight against terror.
I don't believe so. It's a hope that Israelis have nurtured many times in the past, 9/11, all big attacks or wars in the Middle East. It doesn't work that way. You know, it's not a zero-sum game, and the Western world can multitask, and they can fight radical Islam and still believe that it's not okay for Israel to be in the West Bank and to build there, etc., and to continue to pressure Israel. And personally, I, as an Israeli, I completely support any reasonable move against radical Islam. But I have other reasons to believe why we should resolve our conflict with the Palestinians, and they don't concern our fight with radical Islam. They concern the well-being of the State of Israel.
Gentlemen, thank you very, very much for coming and joining me in this part. You cannot respond because I don't have time. Yeah, he had that.
Next week.
Next week. Tomorrow we will be here again at the same time, same place from the Jaffa Port, Israel. Have peace. Have a great day.